FTC Academy Livestream. As always, I'm Dan Fowley, and with me is Peter Chalmers. Peter, how's the weather today? That's our usual intro we seem to do.
And today it's cloudy. We'll get some rain. It's a bit cold over here today, so you know.
Yeah, it's
like Christchurch type of weather here.
It's 6 degrees here.
Okay, it's not Christchurch weather.
It's a bit chilly when I went to grab a coffee before. So, this should be quite excited about this one today, Peter. We last week we delved into the world of DevOps with Giles Bill from Salesforce, and one of the comments we got was from today's guest. So we've decided to carry the conversation on and bring in Ian Gotts to have a chat about how do you manage risk and reward and an efficient life cycle that may even allow for making changes direct in prod. So welcome to the show, Ian.
Thank you. Hi there.
So do you want to...
in prod.
So before we get into what should be a good debate, Ian, do you want to give our audience a little bit of background as to your history and who you are and what you're up to these days?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I've been around the Salesforce ecosystem for about 18 years. So we were one of the first customers in the UK. I think there were 2 people in a shared office that were selling Salesforce at the time. I ended up speaking at one of the first London events. So there were 3 customers, Mark, and 120 people. So it's all got quite a bit bigger since then. So we've been there at the very beginning. I think there were contacts, leads, accounts. I think opportunity just come out. There was no app exchange, so we had to build everything. So I think by the end, our COO had an approach, which is if it's not in Salesforce, it doesn't exist. And he spent his whole life going around the world from our different offices, stamping on Excel spreadsheets and saying, we're going to build something in Salesforce to manage that. So I think we had about 280 custom objects by the end. So we had a pretty sophisticated Salesforce implementation and sold that business in 2011. And at that point, 3 of us retired, and then I got the band back together a couple of years later and said, let's do something again. And we said, well, let's do something similar, but let's support Salesforce. And Adrian said, let's build the application that he wished he'd had when we were building out Salesforce. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty much where Elements is. He's now got to build the application he really wanted. And it's really good fun. The Salesforce ecosystem obviously has grown massively, a lot more sophisticated, a lot more customers, big customers depending on Salesforce. So the landscape has changed, but it's been fantastic watching that growth.
Yeah, excellent.
Sorry, mate, I just stepped all over you there.
No, that's how we do it, Peter. You'd jump in there.
It certainly has changed over time, hasn't it? I mean, if you consider what that all looked like in the first part, as you said, and the fact you had how many custom objects when you finished?
We had 285 custom objects, and 85% of our staff had a Salesforce license.
Right.
Wow.
So major difference. One of the things I love about Salesforce, but is the fact that you can be we talked about this a bit earlier about, you could be a 5-user company, or you could be a 5,000 user company, and you're still using the same infrastructure and all that type of stuff. My view is that you should have the same type of overall process and controls in place, and it's how you manage those things along the way. But it's no different if you're small or large. There may be more controls or more hoops you need to jump through at a 5,000 user org, but in essence, they should be able to leverage the same type of approach and activity. Sorry, I just went down a bit of a rabbit hole there.
I think that's true, but if I think about the journey for the last 20 years, and let me use a car analogy because I'm a petrol head. So 20 years ago, this was a Ford Focus, and there were 5 of us in there, and we jumped in, and you could drive anywhere, and it was really quick, and didn't really matter if people got hurt because there were only 4 or 5 of us. Now, 20 years later, we are an Aston Martin race team at Le Mans, and we need to make sure that race car wins every single time. So there's a team depending on us. And the reason that analogy works is now Salesforce is so much more sophisticated in terms of all the applications that have been built, the ISV apps, the acquisitions that Salesforce has made. It is that genuine, it's a race car. But the problem is, to a certain extent, the sales guys go, don't worry, just get in and push that pedal on the right as hard as you can, and then the steering wheel will fix it. And everyone comes off at the first corner because they haven't told you, by the way, you need a race team, you need a guy who does telematics, you actually need to practice at the circuit. All the things which involve managing a race team is very different from driving my Ford Focus. At the same time, we've got, at the beginning, we had people who had driving licenses. I came in with a background of Accenture, having built systems. Now, the ecosystem, it's a fantastic opportunity for anybody from any walk of life. So there are now people coming in to drive that race car or manage that race team who've never even got a driving license. And we've got to try and bridge that gap, which is how do we fill in the gap to give people the capability to understand what it takes to run a race team? All the things associated with it you have to put around Salesforce to make sure you get around that circuit and everybody wins. Because if you come off at the first corner, it's not just 5 users get hurt, it's 5,000 users get hurt, and then the company can't run. So that analogy, I think, works quite well in terms of both the sophistication of the application, but also the fact we've actually got varying abilities in terms of people coming in. And there's quite a steep learning curve for a lot of people. Now Salesforce is quite daunting when you arrive and go, I'm not sure what to do. I don't understand sandboxes, so I'll develop in production. People go, that's horrible. But maybe it is or maybe it isn't, and we'll come on to that a bit later. But Salesforce is quite daunting, and helping people understand what the foundational skills are to make sure that they implement correctly, I think is a huge challenge now.
Dan will back me up on this. I have a saying that, you can do anything in Salesforce. It's what you should do and how you should do it is the issue. So, yeah. We need to be thinking about things before we do them.
And it's interesting, with the proliferation of cloud SaaS applications in the past 15, 20 years, many of them, rightfully so, are, be it an HR system, where you only have one copy. You only have what is essentially the production instance. And you go in and you turn features on, and people don't think of it as a development platform necessarily when they come to Salesforce. They're like, well, this is just my CRM system, and when I need to create some new fields or something, well, this is where I go to change it and go through that. So I guess it's an education piece, or just that change of mindset that you're actually working on a platform that's pretty powerful, and as you've described it, Ian, there's that chance that you come off at the first corner if you haven't gone through a few driving tutorials first.
Yeah, I think people don't even understand that there is a circuit to drive around. So, how would you know? In terms of talking to the Trailhead team, and I talk about the whole sort of implementation lifecycle, and that Trailhead doesn't necessarily support some of the training items. And they said, well, but Ian, we're not being asked for those training courses. And the answer is, well, if you don't know to ask for these things, then you're never going to ask for them. And I give the Trailhead team a hard time by saying that to a certain extent, you have a responsibility to fill in some of the gaps. Otherwise, you're going to end up with the problems that we're seeing. And we created this thing called All Confessions, which it wasn't meant to be poking holes in Salesforce. It started about a year ago as me just starting to capture some stories, going, well, that's kind of interesting. There's a few horror stories. And then we set up an anonymous website so people could post all these horror stories. And we're up to 900 now. And it's absolutely not aimed at going, look at the problems. Actually, we came back and we did the root cause analysis to try and work out if there's some common themes. Mm-hmm. So actually, it's now great data to understand what the implications are. And the top 4 are poor business analysis, poor architecture, poor documentation, and no DevOps cycle.
Right.
And all 4 of those are not really covered very well in Trailhead. I know they're dealing with architecture now. There are little bits of business analysis. There are some DevOps companies now starting to fill out the training. People like Capado, Gearset, who else? ClickDeploy.io, and obviously Salesforce is launching the DevOps Center. Mm-hmm. So they're starting to fill in these gaps, which is fantastic.
It shows that things are still maturing, isn't it? I mean, it's not just the platform just maturing, but it's also our approach and the way people are doing things on there as well. Yeah.
But that costs money. The issue is that to do all those other things around it, you can't just go, I bought the car. You go, actually, I need to spend the money on servicing and the race team and all the other things that go with it. And I think it's the expectation about you don't just buy the licenses. You need to make sure you invest in the rest of it, including investing in the people to go and support the application.
I mean, one of the common comments that are made to NES in the partner atmosphere is, Salesforce is expensive. The licenses are very expensive, and people will invest in the license, but for some reason are missing or don't see the value in the other pieces that they should be investing in to get the value from the license they've just purchased. And then you'll see those people a little while later where no one's using Salesforce, and really it needs to be re-engineered and re-architected to get it back on track. Identifying that you're spending money, and it is an investment rather than an expense, is what people need to change their view on that. I think ultimately, there are some companies and there's some people out there that get it, but there are others that are still thinking just as it's a cost item at the moment. So,
yeah, that's a good point, Peter, and that's one of the things that we've said in our ideal customer profile to join our academy program is you should have a growth mindset towards Salesforce, and that means seeing it as an investment. It's not a sunk cost. It's you can get the return on the investment, definitely. And some of my favorite use cases of return on investment are really small companies that have purchased just 2 or 3 enterprise licenses, and holy moly, you get a lot of power for that. Because your org limits are the same as a corporate with 5,000 often for some of the limits, and so you can do some really cool stuff with a small business to really make the most of the platform, and particularly if you're an early stage business, run your whole business on the platform. Some pretty cool stuff you can do, but you've got to see it as an investment that leads to the next thing that you're going after.
Now at the same time, not everything has to be on the platform. So there is that balance there, and you've got to work out. And I think that comes back to Ian's point as well. You need that. You need to understand where you're going. Nothing's set in cement, and nothing should be set in cement because things will change. But you just need to understand where you're going, and you need to be driving that way. Because otherwise you end up with half-baked ideas and half-baked things in there, and not a usable system. So.
And that's the architecture piece, which is again, we're lucky that our CTO has years of systems implementation expertise, and the admin team can lean on him and go, okay, we're thinking about this. What are the implications? So we've actually got the guy who came in as an admin a year ago had never heard of Salesforce or heard of us, and is a really capable admin now. But because he actually could sat next to or could talk to someone who had huge levels of experience and therefore wasn't going down blind alleys. And we've got an approach which is we've tried not to put anything in code, so it's all declarative. So there are some principles which Adrian set in place. But pick up your point, Dan, on ROI. If you've got 100 users and it's costing you, I'd pick a number, if only 50 of those users are using it, then the ROI is costing you twice as much per license. Yep. That's the first thing. If you've got all 100 users using it and you haven't customized, you only use it for sales and you're only using standard objects, you're missing half the trick here. If you can then extend it into a whole bunch of other areas, that doesn't cost you any more. Those licenses are then paid for. So you've got to think about it as, where can I extend it and make it really work for the organization, but also how do I make sure that every single person who's got a license is using it for everything they need? And that's the power of customization. I was talking to someone the other day, they said they've thrown away an org with 12 years worth of history in it because they couldn't implement it. It was too much technical debt. And they said, this time we're going to keep it vanilla and we're going to get I think it was Deloitte, to go and implement it vanilla. What? It's just, it doesn't make sense. I mean, you've been badly burnt because you over customized. The answer is not do nothing.
Yeah, the needle doesn't go this. You know, it's the balances in the middle. It's working out what is the right balance. So,
and the reason they threw the last one away is because they had no idea what they built. There was no documentation. It wasn't architected correctly. It had just grown up over time. And after 12 years, they went, we can't do anything with it. We can't get to Lightning, so let's throw it away and start again.
The easiest route out was to just burn it. But the thing is, you're losing so much information on the way through that. So,
what is the cost of doing that?
Mm.
But maybe that is. I mean, they had two different GSIs come in and tell them the best thing to do is throw it away and start again. But maybe then there was a vested interest is that someone wanted to go and rebuild it. Yes. But it's that. By the way, that's not an uncommon story. Mm. We hear a lot of organisations that say, "Fine, we can't go any further. The best way to implement move to Lightning is throw it all away." But hopefully they learn, they use that as the way of building the next thing, leveraging as much of the expertise, knowing what they really want, or at least applying some better practices in terms of the way they build it.
One would hope so, anyway. You don't want to be back in the same position 2 years down the track. They go, oh, how do we get here again? If they don't do things the right way, they don't have the controls in place in the process, then they'll get back there.
But I think we're getting to bigger organisations that have now got people coming in who've have a lot more systems implementation expertise. I think for bigger companies, we're getting beyond hang on, you know a bit about computers, you're the admin. So when you talk about some of the large enterprise customers, they have got centres of excellence, they have got dev teams, they have got business analysts. So they're applying the same disciplines that, say, in the world of SAP or Oracle. I mean, you couldn't implement SAP unless you knew what you're doing.
Yeah.
It came on 27 DVDs and it took like 10 days to stand up.
Some would say the people that do implement it don't know what they're doing, but anyway.
And we kind of touched on this last week. It's that transition that often, let's say in the first decade of Salesforce, it was the business. It was someone in the sales department went and purchased it on their credit card, and then, like you just said, oh, one of my sales guys, he tinkers with a bit of IT, he can set it up, and that was the path they went. And now it's made that transition into the more sophisticated. The IT department suddenly realized what was going on without their authority over it, and so they've come in, taken it, and put some more rigor around it, and that creates a tension. And that's probably a good segue into a business user may have originally we need a new custom field, let's just bang that into prod. I don't know any better, and now the IT department's putting some rigor and process around that. So what's an example where it still would be okay to build something directly in prod, and how do you weigh up the risk of that?
Okay, so most people would say you should never build in production, and I think the issue is that what may seem like quite a benign change, it's fairly simple. Like, I'm just going to remove this field, or I'm just going to change this pick list, and you have no idea what unravels when you do that. So you change it, that pick list actually kicks off a flow. There's a flow that then and. You do that once, and it all blows up in your face, and you sort of go, I'm never going to do that again. So it's almost, if you don't understand what the implication of making a change is, you can never make that change in production. So this is all about understanding and managing the risk of any change. So I would suggest that you could make any change in production if you understood what the risk was. And everything is a risk reward, isn't it? Which is, if it takes a month to take it through multiple sandboxes and we do a release cycle every month, there's a cost associated with that. And you've got to weigh that off against the risk of, do I understand what's going to happen? So a simple change, which is, I'm just going to change this field. I think there was one of the confessions said, I deleted one field which trashed 40 dashboards, 80 reports in 2 weeks of my life. Okay. At the other end, you can make some quite complicated changes which actually have no impact at all. because they're not touching other things. So it's not the complexity that necessary. It's a combination of the risk. It's a combination of the impact and the complexity which actually determines the risk of making that change. Right?
Yeah, and there's certain. Yeah, the system will prevent you making dumb mistakes. If that field you tried to remove is referenced by an Apex class, good luck trying to remove that field. It's gonna block it. But yeah, as you say, then reports, dashboards, other things. So understanding the consequences of each change you could make and weighing that into your decision. Probably additive changes are more likely to be okay than removing stuff, unless it's you've done all the analysis to prove that something is no longer needed or not referenced anywhere else. I think we're starting to see some tools that are doing a good job of showing all the references between components so that you can make safer decisions. But yeah, there's so many things you can't foresee. As exactly said, this thing touches a flow which suddenly people say, oh, customer's not getting this notification email. Oh, well, that trace it all the way back to something that seemed quite unrelated in the beginning when you're just maybe trying to tidy up the org per se, and do a bit of a spring clean. So, like Tanya, but hot fix is an interesting one. That's one where I think you know the problem, you've diagnosed it, you need to get a fix into prod pretty promptly. Going about that, but then the key thing there is to have a hotfix process, which basically says, right, then we work our way backwards and make sure the other environments in the release train are also up to date, and whatever your process is, if that means the last step of that is making sure your version control and everything is in sync, then seeing that through all the way so that when those changes roll back the correct way on a release train, that it's not just going to overwrite that hotfix that you've just put in.
I think you're right. So adding, it feels safe. Changes, less safe. Deletions are really hard, which is why you get people maxing out objects, max fields. I mean, I was talking to a customer the other day who's got 3 opportunity objects because they've maxed out the first 2.
That I haven't come across. I've certainly seen the 500 field limit hit, but I haven't seen resorting to having a whole new object to have more fields.
Oh yeah, well, we see that a lot in there are a number of confessions where they've got 2 product objects, multiple opportunity objects. I mean, there are some of the architecture ones are just weird, but in terms of we daren't delete fields, there's always we just need to delete 10 fields so I can do the next project, which has to add some more fields. So it doesn't tend to be a spring clean. It's like, okay, what can I move out of the way so I can get the next thing built? And I mean, the number of people who've got like an opportunity page layer that looks like a CVS receipt. It just goes on and on and on and on and on. So it's not only you've got like 422 fields, but they're all on the page layout.
Yeah, that's one of the things that really annoys me. But dynamic pages are coming, so that might change that.
Well, yeah, but okay. So we've got a view that the confused mind says no. So if I get confronted with a whole bunch of fields that I don't know what to do with, either I'm going to just try and enter anything just so I can get off, which is just trashes the data. You've got poor data, or I'm confused, so I don't know what to put in, particularly pick list values. Okay, so pick list values are ones which are really hard to delete because actually knowing where a pick list value is used is really hard. So you just keep adding them and adding them and adding them and there's no help for it. You can't get there's only 255 characters of standard help. So describing what all these pick list values are. So here's a question: what's the maximum number of lead source values you're allowed?
Ooh.
What's the limit?
Go on, pick a number.
1,000.
I was gonna guess 100.
1,000. How do I know that? Because someone said they'd maxed out lead source.
1,000 lead sources.
And you can imagine a sales rep going, I need to pick the right one.
So they're going to either default to the first one.
Yeah, but again, back to if I don't delete it, I can only add them. So what am I meant to do?
Yeah.
I don't delete this because I've no idea what will happen. Oh, and this idea will just delete it, and if nobody shouts within 2 weeks, then you probably got away with it. It's fantastic unless it's used at quarter end or year end.
What could
The
possibly
idea
go
of just
wrong?
delete it is in the recycle bin, and we can get it back if we need to. So, I mean, there are some quite...
It's interesting ways to manage the risk.
Well, there's some quite naive approaches there because the tools aren't, as you said, Dan, the tools haven't been around to do a decent job of understanding what the implications are. Okay, I mean, obviously Elements, we built this application and we're using the metadata API and the dependency API so we can do some of that analysis. But there's some stuff, excuse me, stuff on our roadmap that we're working on. Stuff like deleting a record page, a record type is really hard. So Salesforce doesn't, I mean, when you try and delete a field, it says these things, okay, it's used in these things. That's only a fraction of the places that a field could be used. There is no support for record types. The only way you can do that is just do the hard coding, because also record type can be stored in 2 or 3 different ways. So there's some of the stuff is really hard to do. And getting rid of record types is something which, again, is, if you're trying to clean up an org, that's something you'd want to go and do. Another little question for you. How many different bits of code did we have to write to work out where a field is in a process builder workflow? So how many different ways could a field be stored in a process builder workflow? 42.
Seriously?
That just feels like a number. 42.
It genuinely was.
That's a random number.
Oh yeah, it is. It's 6 times 9, isn't it? For those who are hitchhikers.
Okay, right.
But it was. There are so many different places it's stored in different formats,
right.
And it's stored as variables. So you have to read back up the variable chain to find out what the real field name was. So the sophistication that's been built in Salesforce makes it slightly more challenging to have some. Back to your comment about risk, to really be able to go, I'm definitely be able to delete that without the whole thing exploding in my face.
Yeah,
but
I was going to say, so much of that documentation is in people's heads, and in big corporates, people move on, new people come along, and they have no chance of understanding the historical history of why something was done a particular way and where those traps are. The traps have been laid, and they're just going to fall, and someone new is going to fall into them.
You said the really important word, why. Okay, I can probably look at the org and work out how you did it.
Yeah.
But I've no idea why you did it. Unless I understand why, I can't understand the implications. So what were you thinking when you did that? So that why then, and then what was the business process behind it? Because that will help me understand what else might be connected to it. The dependency API is really good. It's now starting to, the dependency API basically leverages the code that when you try and delete a field says, don't delete it because of these reasons. Right. So that gives you a subset of the reasons. And then you can go a bit further, but at least it's starting to give you some ideas. And we've added to that so you can build multi-level where used. So you go, this is used here, but that's also used there, which is used there. So you can work back. So there's 2 things. One, you can understand the risk, but also you can go, if I change that, I also need to understand what I might need to change in that. So this page is used in, I know, that flow, but that flow then calls that Apex class, which is then used somewhere else. And you can go back multiple levels. And there are a few things we did in our org where our admin, when I was about to go and change it, I just did the dependency tree and it went, and he went, oh wow, yeah, okay, I didn't realize quite what was going to happen. I'm so glad I didn't make that change. So it's, yeah, it's that kind of stuff, I think, which is what scares admins. So come at it from the other way. I think you should take the approach which is, I should try and develop in production and understand how to manage my risk down so I can develop in production, because that's got to be my default. It's the quickest, it's the cheapest. I know this seems like heresy, but if you start by going, how do I get a release down to a risk level where I could develop in production, because then I can deliver what my business users want as quickly as possible.
I mean, that makes sense. And I can see where you're going. But how do you identify the risk? How do you manage that?
Okay, so the first thing is you've got to, it starts with analysis. You've got to go and write great user stories.
Mm-hmm.
Requirements aren't user stories. Requirements are what the business guys thought they might want in an idle moment when they were thinking about it. A user story is the analyzed set of requirements that turn in are basically the technical requirements. Okay?
Yep.
So to get from a requirement to a user story, I need to do enough validation of the requirements, which means I need to understand what the operational processes look like.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So I've already talked about 3 things that most people don't even do. They take requirements and they go, I'll take the requirement, I'm a just admin, I can just do that, I'll do what you want. And they take a requirement and they build something into an app. And then it's not really what the user wanted because they didn't describe it very well. So then we've been all the way around the cycle to adoption and people don't use it. And when you find out why they don't use it, it's because it's not what I wanted.
Yep.
Yeah, but it's what you said you wanted. Yeah, I know, but I didn't, sorry about that, I didn't.
That's not what I really meant.
Yeah. So the job of the admin or the business analyst is to ask the questions, which is, what do you really want? And so I always use the example of a pick list. So pick list. I want a new pick list. Well, do you really? So you may not want a pick list. So describe to me how the business needs to change. And when you start describing that, one answer might be, we already do that. And the user goes, oh, I didn't realize. Okay, so I've already solved your problem by going, use the application how we built it. The second is they go, oh, actually, I don't need a pick list. It's a record type, and we need a record type, and we need some validation, and we need a report. So it wasn't just a pick list. Actually, it was a whole bunch of other things we needed to do to deliver what you wanted. Or it may genuinely be a pick list, but we also need to do some other things with it. So that requirements, once you understand the business process, you validate some requirements, and you may add new ones that the end user hadn't considered. And then architecturally, you may need to do it in a different way because of the way the system's been configured. And that's what then drives out the user story. None of this should be rocket science, but sadly for lots of people it is. Now I can look at the user story and go, what is the risk of this user story? So if I look at the impact across 3 factors, one is technically, what is the risk? So I know all the things I have to change to make this user story work, and I can look at them and go, all right, if I touch that, what else is going to be impacted? So I can look at the technical risk. I can look at the operational risk. I can say, how much does the business have to change when we put this in? So is there a big business change aspect to this? And then is there a regulatory risk?
Yep.
So I put this in, we're now going to break our HIPAA compliance or our GDPR or whatever. So we can now combine those as an impact risk. So we can now work out whether that's high, medium, or low. And then we can look at the complexity, which is down the other dimension, to say, how difficult is this going to be to build? High, medium, or low. And then we can do a little matrix. So if it's high and high, it's definitely high risk. If it's low and low, it's definitely low risk or whatever. So I can then look at that user story and say, this is a low risk user story. Mm-hmm. With me so far? I might have 3 user stories in a release. If they're all low, fantastic. It's a low risk user story. I can put that into production, straight into production. If I've got 1 high and 2 lows, that's high. But maybe if I want to get this in quickly, let's pull out that user story that's high, and now I'm just left with 2 lows I can now put into production.
Yeah.
So I've now got a better picture to start to make some decisions about how I construct my releases. And instead of putting everything, if I don't have any view, I have to consider everything as high. Yep. So everything has to go through the full deployment pipeline, which costs, I don't know, we're talking to one customer, they reckon it's between $3,000 and $6,000 to put it through that full deployment pipeline. So I can put it straight into production, maybe It costs me only $500. So that's the first benefit. Then the other piece comes out, which is, forget the cost of dev, because they're really cheap. The cost of sales guys is really expensive if we think of just from a sales perspective. If I've got this into production faster, how much more effective are they, or how much less time have they wasted? So let's do a little calculation, and you can help me by you know what the numbers are. So what's the loaded cost of an admin in dollars per year?
That depends which market you're in, though. But let's pull a number out of the air.
Nice round 100.
Yep.
$100,000 a year. These must be Australian dollars. So I put 100K in, and then same cost for a developer. Yeah. So what's this loaded cost for a sales rep? Double that?
I'd say double that, yeah.
Yep.
200,000. Okay, right. So if I put something, let's take a simple thing. It's a cleanup. I've got, I'm removing 10 fields, and I'm putting in 2 validation rules, and I'm putting help on 10 fields. So this is a relatively low risk.
Yep.
Removing 10 fields, which I know aren't used because I can see there's no data in them, they're not connected. I know that we have a problem with 2 fields, so I'm going to add a couple of validation rules to make sure people pick the right stuff. And I'm going to put help on 10 fields because I know people get it wrong. So that I'm considering that's all low risk.
Mm-hmm.
So how many hours does it take to, forget the development, but how many hours does it take to put it into a sandbox?
For something like that, let's say 3 hours.
3 hours.
Well, we
and then we've got to migrate it from sandbox to UAT.
Yep.
So what's that? Another 3 hours?
To push it,
change it.
Yeah.
And so therefore it's the admin, and we've got some time from the tester, and then we've got to push it from UAT to production.
Which should still be about the same.
Same again.
Okay. So we don't need a tester to push it to production. Okay. So the wasted cost, if we didn't have to go through all those steps, the wasted cost is $750. Okay, which is like, okay, whatever. But how much? Okay, so removing those fields and validation rules, how many minutes is that going to make it quicker for that sales rep to look at that page? Because they're not confused. I got it wrong, got to go back, not quite sure. And let's say let's make it 2 minutes.
Sure.
Right? And I touch that opportunity page how many times a day?
5.
5? Okay.
Pull
and how many reps have we got? 200? 100?
Let's go with 100.
Yep.
100. And how often do we release? Is it monthly releases, 3 monthly?
Every 2 weeks.
Well, there you go.
Okay,
more aggressive than I.
Okay, so 2 weeks. So I've got to wait 14 days for that release. Okay. So the cost in terms of salespeople's time wasted, forget the fact that they're more useful, just the time they wasted is $29,000. And it's $750 of wasted dev time. So what's interesting is it's nothing at all to do with making the devs people more efficient. It's actually what you're doing to the business agility and the morale of the salesperson. If someone says, I'm having a problem with this field, and a day later it's in, and I can do that every day. I was talking to our admin, we're getting 40 change requests in a week.
Yeah.
Now, if we now think about digital transformation and the fact that how much people have got to change as we come out of COVID because business models have changed, I have no idea what the new world looks like. So the ability for the business to cycle really quickly and have Salesforce support it, this becomes even more important. So don't forget about the wasted time. It's about the opportunity cost of being able to make the business more agile. And everyone used to talk about digital transformation because it was 5 years away. We didn't need to worry about it. It's now 5 weeks away, and we've got to cycle our applications so much faster now. So if we
don't have the luxury of time, do we?
Sorry,
we don't have the luxury of time on those things anymore. We've got to move faster. We've got to be able to deliver this stuff faster and in the right ways. So.
Yeah, and I was reading Capado's DevOps report, and they've got 4 metrics. One is how often do you release? Second was cycle time. But then there were 2 other metrics. One was how many times does the release fail, and how quickly can you restore it?
Yeah.
What? Why are these even a thing? why are we even having to measure how quickly we can break what we just put, go back and fix what we broke, and then how often do we break a release? That shows there's no, if that's a metric that's important in the world, then there's clearly something wrong in terms of the way we're constructing releases. So I think it's, maybe, I wasn't a developer in the SAP world, but maybe that was an issue in SAP as well. But it feels like we're at the cusp now of having to change the maturity at the same time as DevOps is becoming more important in the Salesforce ecosystem.
Yeah.
We have to think about things in a different way than just say, okay, we're now going to instantiate a really rigorous cycle that takes 3 months to get anything into dev, and then all the way through out of the other end. Anyway, so that was, sorry, I've dragged you through my little spreadsheet, but actually the numbers are quite frightening when you look at it, when you start understanding the implications of, so if I change that to 30 days, so we have what Peter said, right, you've just doubled the cost.
Right.
So Dan's cheaper. Dan's half the price of Peter. So.
But comes with the overhead of more frequent releases and the cost of those. So it's a balancing act.
Well, yeah, indeed. But it's so the question then is how hard is this going to be to start to get people to change, to think about this in a different way?
Yeah.
Very good question. How do we get them there?
Yeah. So it's probably a reasonable segue as we sort of start to wrap up. So Ian, what you described in there around user stories and mapping the risk of user stories, there was a really good blog post that people can find on the Salesforce Ben website, which is a really good resource for everyone out there. And there was a diagram in that post, which our users are now seeing on screen. I just want to quickly sort of talk us through that diagram, because it's a fairly comprehensive view of a loop that you would go through to make sure that you've got a robust release cycle.
Yeah, and it's something that I came up with. We've been talking to the Capado team and Salesforce about it, so it's not something we've that's sort of it's been made up in isolation. First of all, it's a schematic. It's not these are the steps you have to do one after another. Clearly, it's a bit more involved than that. Although we have documented our operational processes as proper processes, and if anybody wants a copy of those process diagrams, I think there are 24 in total, which describe how we do our development, including this idea of risk management. Ping me an email, we can give you copies of those, so that's not an issue. But the cycle starts anywhere. I mean, it's the cycle. But if we start sort of with at the bottom left, analyze, the whole idea of there is a level of analysis which is kicked off by either requirements coming out or feedback coming out of the green box into the purple one, and then you've got to capture those requirements centrally, validate them as I talked about by looking at the process maps, looking at the data models, then start to build some user stories and then some org impact analysis to understand the risk of those user stories. And I think that we always talk about sort of the business IT divide. We shouldn't be going out of the purple into the blue unless we're really, really clear about what we should be building. The moment you start getting into blue, it starts to get really expensive because you're in the build cycle. So don't leave the purple boxes until you are really clear about what you're building. When you're in blue, then it's all about, do I configure or code? So is it going to be declarative or am I going to be coding? The bit about documentation, I think Peter picks up earlier, which is, and you, Dan, as well, which is, if I don't write down why I'm doing this, when someone comes back the next time around the cycle, they will have no idea what happened. And documentation doesn't have to be 50 pages of Word. It could be a photograph of a whiteboard. It could be a lucid chart, a process map in Elements. It doesn't matter what it is, but it needs to be there linked to the metadata items so I can see them in context. If you give it to me in a binder, I'm never going to look at it. I'm never going to update it. So I think that the important word around documentation is there is no such thing as later. You've got to do it in the moment. So then out of there, we've then got a code which we're now ready to deploy. So again, backing up the metadata, so in case we need to roll back, deploying it, then we're thinking about data load, but then we're feeding off, the impact analysis, we're feeding off the data model to understand how to do the data load, how to design our data load architecture, because we understand what the data model looks like. And then into release. And release isn't just code. Release might be the training material. It might be the process maps, which we use as training material. So release isn't just, we got the code done. You actually need to deliver a complete product. So the training's updated, the process maps are there, the support's there. And then we're into operate. And operate's all about, have we got backup and restore? Interesting thing, nobody pays for backup. Everyone's paying for restore. Okay, it doesn't matter if you can't restore. I mean, you've got to be able to restore and prove that the restore works. So there's that. Compliance is all about, if we've changed the business processes, can we justify to the auditors that actually everyone's following due process? Really important if it's food, financial services, pharma, oil and gas. I mean, the compliance is everywhere now. Think about what. So then got compliance, monitoring in terms of, again, back to the comment, which is if none of the users are logging in, then why are we paying for the licenses? We need to pick up some trends. If people aren't logging in, we need to understand why. In fact, I just did a Trailhead live session about how to drive up adoption by looking at the analysis. Okay, if people aren't logging in, why not? They must be using something. If they're not using the app we built, what are they using instead? If they are logging in intermittently, like, why are they not using the app? Did we build the wrong app? If they're giving us feedback, fantastic. Let's celebrate that and make sure that we can respond to that feedback as quickly as possible. So we reinforce that cycle. If someone comes up with a really sensible change and we can get it into production tomorrow, how excited are they going to be? They're going to tell their mates, which is all about starting to drive this cycle more quickly. So that's sort of my little journey around there. Salesforce provides some of the capabilities. Some of them they've very carefully left some gaps. So ISV partners like ourselves, people like Capado, can fill in those gaps. But you can't make the cycle go around faster by skipping out steps. Even a small change, you mentally go through okay, what do I need to do for this? So you can go around that cycle. We put stuff into production in 45 minutes, but we have thought through every single step.
Yep.
We have documented it. We've gone around that. You can't go faster by just missing out a few steps, because it will come back and bite you at some point in the future, or the person who comes after you. So hopefully that was helpful. I know it's
that was very good. Ian, I was thinking maybe if we want to wrap up, if you want to give us a bit of detail about where Elements plays in that, and maybe a little bit of a pitch for the product.
That's very kind of you. Where do we play? We deal with all the purple boxes. So we are. So think of us as the documentation hub at the center of this. So we're managing the requirements, the user stories, the process maps, the documentation, and then we build. We pull all the metadata out of an org, and then we build all the automated documentation, all that analysis. So we're basically doing all the heavy lifting that would be really hard to do if you were trying to do it manually. But we're also the central hub for documentation, because those requirements get reused. The process maps get reused. So when you said you ought to write stuff down, well, if you write it in Elements, then everybody has access to it the next time round. So in a certain way, we're at the hub trying to make sure this cycle goes faster. Relatively quick to go and get it set up. Takes 1 minute and 58 seconds to go from never having touched it to kicking off your first sync. I know it's that because I watched the video the other day. But really quick to go do a 14-day trial, and it will sync your org. Takes between 10 minutes and 2 hours to sync the org and give you that org analysis. And then suddenly you know what you're up against. So if you're a brand new admin, then you know what you've walked into. If you're a consultant, great. First 2 hours of the engagement, you can understand what sort of org you're trying to deal with so you can manage your client better. So quite powerful just using that free 14-day trial. So I'd encourage everybody to have a play with it. If it works, then absolutely come and talk to us about using it. But we're getting more and more people saying, like, where have you been the last 10 years? So I think we've struck a chord inside the ecosystem in terms of something that everybody needs.
Excellent. Well, we'd encourage everyone to go and check that out. And that's obviously, from what I'm understanding, Ian, someone can get a lot of value from the 14-day trial and get those insights that you provide, and hopefully they see value in continuing to see those benefits as part of an ongoing process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Well, this is officially the longest running live stream we've done, so that must speak to the quality of the conversation, I think, and the topics at hand. Ian, absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for joining us today and engaging in the conversation. It's been lively and fun. And to everyone out there watching, we'll see you again next week. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Great fun.